You're not even listening to me, are you? Janice sighed, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken resentments. What? I replied, pretending to tear my eyes away from the TV screen. I'm right here. You're not hearing a word I say, she said, her voice strained. It's like you're in another world. Our marriage had become a series of missed connections and misunderstandings. The spark we once had now flickered weakly, like a candle in a storm. We had been together for 15 years, and the flame was definitely not what it used to be. But it was more than that. There was something specific she wasn't giving me anymore. Something intimate that she had once been so eager to perform. What's the matter? I asked, turning to face her. Her eyes searched mine, looking for a clue, an indication that I had some idea of what was bothering her. It's just, I feel like we're not, connecting, she said, her voice barely above a murmur, in the way we used to. I knew what she meant, but I didn't dare voice it. The subject had become a minefield we both tiptoed around, afraid of setting off an explosion that would blow what was left of our relationship apart. But as the silence stretched on, I realized I had to say something. Look, Janice, I began. I know things have been tough lately. We've both got a lot on our plates, but I'm here for you. The words felt hollow, like a band-aid over a bullet wound. She stared at me, her expression unchanged, and I knew she felt it too. It's just that one thing, she said finally, her gaze dropping to the floor. It's so simple, but it means so much. I swallowed hard, nodded. I know, I said, and I'm sorry. But the truth was, I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to fix us. And as the silence grew heavier, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Rogers next door. She was 60 if she was a day. But there was something about her that was different. Something that made me feel alive in a way Janice hadn't in years. It started innocently enough. A friendly wave over the fence as I mowed the lawn. A borrowed cup of sugar here and there. But it quickly evolved into something more. She had this way of looking at me. This knowing smile that made my heart race. And she always took her teeth out when she talked to me, leaving her mouth a warm, inviting cavern that seemed to whisper secrets only I could understand. One evening, after Janice had gone to bed early with a migraine, I found myself on the porch, staring over at Mrs. Rogers' house. The lights were still on, and I could see her silhouette through the curtains, moving with a grace that belied her age. It was like watching a dance, and I was the only one privy to the performance. Without thinking, I crossed the yard, my feet carrying me closer to the forbidden allure of that dimly lit house. The door was unlocked, and as I stepped inside, the scent of her perfume filled my nostrils, a heady mix of jasmine and something darker, something that spoke of hidden desires. In the living room, she sat on the couch, her teeth resting on the coffee table, a knowing look in her eyes. She patted the cushion next to her, and I sat, my heart hammering in my chest like a drum at a tribal ceremony. I know what you need, she said, her voice a smooth whiskey, and I can give it to you. I looked at her, torn between guilt and need, but the need won out. I leaned in, my breathing ragged, and she took me in her mouth, her gums a soft, velvety caress that sent shockwaves through my body. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before, a mix of the taboo and the incredibly erotic. As the night grew darker, the line between neighborly comfort and adultery blurred, and I knew that I had made a choice that would change the course of my life forever. But in that moment, all I could think of was the warmth of Mrs. Rogers' mouth and the feeling of being truly alive again. We didn't speak as she worked her magic, our breaths mingling in the quiet of her living room. The sound of her gums gently gliding along my shaft was the only music to our clandestine dance of desire. The TV played some old black and white movie in the background, the muted whispers of actors long gone serving as a bizarre soundtrack to our tryst. Her hands caressed my thighs, urging me closer, her eyes never leaving mine. And when the dam finally broke, and I released into her welcoming embrace, she took it all without a gag or a flinch, her cheeks hollowing out with the effort of swallowing every drop. It was a sight that was simultaneously disturbing and utterly mesmerizing. Afterwards, she patted my back gently, her teeth back in her mouth. giving me a smile that was both reassuring and predatory. "Better?" she asked, her voice a smoky purr that seemed to resonate through my very soul. "Yeah," I breathed, still reeling from the intensity of the experience. "Better." The next few weeks were a blur of guilt and stolen moments with Mrs. Rogers. Each time was better than the last, each encounter leaving me more addicted to her toothless embrace. Janice noticed the change in me, the new light in my eyes, but she attributed it to the latest self-help book she had convinced me to read. Little did she know it was the neighbor next door who had breathed new life into our sexless marriage. But as the secret grew between us, so too did the tension in our home. Janice could feel it, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Our conversations grew strained, our touches less affectionate. The very thing that was bringing me alive was slowly killing what was left of our connection. One evening, as I sat watching TV with Janice, my mind drifted to the sweet taste of Mrs. Rogers' mouth and the feeling of her gums on my skin. The guilt was a knot in my stomach, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed. And as I looked over at my wife, her eyes glazed over with pain and confusion, I knew that I had to make a choice. The choice between the comfort of familiarity and the fire of a newfound passion. The choice between a life of quiet desperation and one of raw, unfiltered desire. The choice was clear, but making it was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. I couldn't keep living a lie. The secret was eating away at me, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth that not even Mrs. Rogers' skilled gums could wash away. And so, one fateful night, as Janice lay sleeping next to me, I made up my mind. I slid out of bed, my heart racing like a fugitive's, and padded over to the nightstand where I kept a piece of paper and a pen. I began to write a note, the words spilling out of me like a confession to a silent priest. I told her everything, the longing, the frustration, the way Mrs. Rogers had filled a void that had grown wider than the Grand Canyon between us. When I was done, I placed the note gently on her pillow, taking a moment to trace the outline of her face with my trembling hand. Then, I turned and walked out of our bedroom, down the hall, and out the front door. Mrs. Rogers' house was dark, but I knew she'd be waiting. I knocked softly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and she appeared, a vision in a silk robe that clung to her curves. She took one look at my face and knew. We didn't speak as she led me inside, her hand a comforting warmth in the chilly embrace of the night. We went straight to her bedroom, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of jasmine. She took my hand and guided me to the bed, her eyes never leaving mine. This time, as she took me into her mouth, it was different. The guilt was still there, a constant throb in the back of my mind, but it was mixed with something else, a sadness, a regret that this was what it had come to. But as she worked her gums over me, I couldn't deny the pleasure that surged through my body. Afterwards, I lay there, panting, trying to catch my breath. Mrs. Rogers looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You can't keep doing this," she said finally, her voice firm. "You need to fix things with Janice, or you'll lose her for good." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I knew she was right. I had to find a way to save my marriage, to rekindle the spark that had brought Janice and me together in the first place. But as I pulled my clothes back on, I realized that I had no idea where to start. The following days were a blur of half-hearted attempts at apologies and awkward silences. Janice read the note, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, but she said nothing. We both knew that words alone couldn't bridge the gap that had opened up between us. It was time for action. I signed us up for couples therapy, bought her flowers, cooked her favorite meals, but nothing seemed to work. The more I tried, the more she withdrew, until she was as cold and untouchable as a statue of ice. And all the while, Mrs. Rogers watched from across the fence, her knowing smile now a look of pity that I couldn't stand. I knew I had to tell her it was over, that I couldn't keep going down this destructive path. So one day I did. "I can't do this anymore," I told her, the words sticking in my throat like a mouthful of sand. "I love Janice. I have to try to fix us." Her eyes searched my face, and then she nodded. understanding in her gaze. "I know," she said, "but remember, I'm always here if you need me." With that, she closed the door, leaving me to face the wreckage of my life. And as I walked back across the yard, the weight of my decisions settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. But as I stepped into my own house, I heard Janice's soft voice calling my name, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Maybe the fire wasn't completely out. And with that thought, I took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown, ready to fight for what I had so carelessly neglected. We sat down at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken accusations and hurt feelings. I reached out to take Janice's hand, but she pulled away, her eyes searching mine for the truth. "I know I've messed up," I began, my voice shaking, "and I can't promise that I'll be able to change overnight, but I want to try." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I just want to feel desired again," she said. "I want us to be close like we used to be." The therapist's office was a sterile, beige-walled prison where we laid bare our souls and our shortcomings. Janice spoke of her fears and insecurities, and I listened, truly listening for the first time in what felt like forever. And as she talked, I saw her not just as my wife, but as a woman with needs and desires of her own. Weeks turned into months, and the slow dance of reconciliation began. It was painful, it was awkward, but it was real. We talked about our needs, our frustrations, and the little things that had chipped away at our love. And slowly, like a sculptor revealing a hidden masterpiece, we began to rediscover the intimacy that had brought us together. One night, after a particularly intense therapy session, Janice looked at me with a tentative smile. "Could you do something for me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. My heart raced. Was she finally ready to let me back in? "Anything," I said, hope blossoming in my chest like a rose in spring. She took a deep breath. "Could you perform oral sex on me?" The words hung in the air, a silent challenge and an offering of trust. And as I took her in my arms, her mouth trembling under mine, I knew that this was the moment we had been working towards. This was our chance to start anew. The taste of her was sweet and familiar, a flavor I had missed more than I ever knew. I took my time, savoring every moment, every gasp and moan that escaped her lips. And as I felt her body tense, her legs wrapping around my neck, I knew that we were on the precipice of something beautiful. And as we lay in bed, our bodies entwined in the afterglow of passion, I knew that I had made the right choice. The fire wasn't out. It had just been smoldering, waiting for the right spark to set it ablaze once more. And as we drifted off to sleep, hand in hand, I whispered a silent thank you to the woman who had unwittingly set our love on a new course. As she came apart in my arms, the walls between us crumbled like sand castles under a raw vulnerability of giving and receiving pleasure. And when she looked at me, her eyes glazed with passion, I knew that we had found our way back to each other. Mrs. Rogers remained a shadow in the corner of my mind, a reminder of the path I had almost taken. But as Janice and I grew closer, her allure faded, replaced by the warmth and love that I had almost lost. Our marriage was far from perfect, but it was ours, and we were fighting to keep it alive. The guilt still nibbled at me like a persistent rodent, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the here and now, because in the end, it wasn't about Mrs. Rogers or her toothless mouth. It was about Janice and me, and the love we had built together over 15 tumultuous years. And as we lay in bed, our bodies entwined in the afterglow of passion, I knew that I had made the right choice. The fire wasn't out. It had just been smoldering, waiting for the right spark to set it ablaze once more. And as we drifted off to sleep, hand in hand, I whispered a silent thank you to the woman who had unwittingly set our love on a new course.